Last week we considered who it is that we are praying to when we say the Lord's Prayer, and which images of God help us to draw closer to Him in prayer. This week our thoughts turn to the second section of the Lord's Prayer. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. We'll have a chance to think about what we understand by the term God's kingdom and whether we think that God's will is being done on earth or if there's still some work to be carried out in that department. But to start off, let's ponder that familiar phrase, thy kingdom come. This expresses the hope of God's people throughout all of history. Your kingdom come. The Kaddish, which you'll recall from last week, was the well-known Jewish prayer upon which Jesus based the prayer we all now know as the Lord's Prayer, has very similar words. May he rule his kingdom in your lifetime and in your days and in the lifetime of the whole house of Israel, speedily and soon. God's people looked for God to send his anointed one, the Messiah, to rule the earth. And now that Jesus seemed to be establishing the kingdom of heaven in front of their eyes, his disciples were living with the anticipation of the completion of that program. God's anointed Messiah was here and at work bringing the rule of God. So, what is that rule or that kingdom? Well, it seems to me that it's summed up in a couple of Jesus's key teachings. If you remember the events from Luke's Gospel, Jesus returns from his testing in the wilderness, what we often call the temptations, to begin his teaching ministry. On one occasion, he went into the synagogue in Nazareth, and then we read this in Luke chapter 4. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. Unrolling it, he found the place where it is written, The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour. Then he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant and sat down. The eyes of everyone in the synagogue were fastened on him. He began by saying to them, Today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing. So God's kingdom is one where there is hope, where the oppressed, the poor, the sick, all who are vulnerable are given hope. And as I understand it, that hope comes in two packages. The first is a spiritual hope, that God's love is freely available to all. God doesn't ever discriminate. All are loved equally and unconditionally. There are no outsiders in God's kingdom. All are welcomed in. And the second package of hope is this, that God's people, those who hear the voice of Jesus and listen to his teaching, have those exact same kingdom values. How is God's kingdom evident here on earth? Because those who follow God love everyone. Those who follow God show compassion and love and kindness to the poor and to the sick, to the prisoner and the refugee. Those who follow God don't ever discriminate on grounds of wealth, education, gender, age, marriage status, or the colour of skin, or anything else that may seek to divide us. So, thy kingdom come, thy will be done, a kingdom of love, hope and acceptance. God's will, his yearning to see those heavenly values of love, hope and acceptance demonstrated here on earth.